Penn State football, a top 10 team going into the 2024 season. Drew Allar, a top 10 starting quarterback in all of college football. The skeptics might disagree, but the analytics say otherwise.
You are Locked On Nittany Lions, your daily podcast on the Penn State Nittany Lions. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
That is right, Penn State fans. You are Locked On Nittany Lions. Thanks so much for making us your first listen and watch every single day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Zach Seyko, bringing you all things Penn State sports. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, the official sportsbook of Locked On. And right now, new customers, when you join today, you'll get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more is a winner. It's that simple. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. And if you're not already, become an everydayer. Subscribe to Locked On Nittany Lions on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast for the latest analysis, conversations around your favorite Penn State sports. We're talking Penn State football today as we welcome back PFF college football analyst Max Chadwick. He's also the host of the college football show over on PFF Preferred Walk On. Max, it's great to talk to you and get the analytical side of what Penn State, how Penn State is shaping up for the 2024 season.
Of course, Zach. Thanks for having me on again. And yeah, I think I told you this before, but I mean, I grew up a huge Penn State fan. I still, I am supposed to be an unbiased college football journalist, but I still kind of root for Penn State on the side. So I love talking Penn State football. So I'm excited to talk to you today.
Well, let's go right into it. PFF, of course, great resource. I use it. I look forward to it, seeing like what the game grades are for each individual player to kind of get an assessment, because I'm not able to watch every single individual player every single play. So it's nice to get a true look at every game recap, especially for Penn State here. But PFF doing preseason grades for everybody else. How does Penn State stack up for the 2024 season with all of the changes? We're going to talk more about Andy Kotelnicki and Tom Allen specifically, but generally, how do they stack up against the national competition for 2024?
Yeah, so I'm actually next week, I believe I'm going to be updating my way too early top 25 rankings, just because I put them out immediately after the national title game and everything changed in college football. Obviously, the transfer portal boomed. Coaches were leaving left and right. Players were leaving left and right. NFL draft declarations that you didn't expect. Players coming back that you didn't expect. So I'm going to update that next week. I'm going to have Penn State in the top 10. I think that they have some really, really talented players coming back. Of course, there are huge question marks that they have specifically offensively next year that they're going to need to answer, and even defensively too, with the losses that they suffered there. But I still think this is a talented team that should be competing at the top of the Big Ten with the likes of, I think Ohio State is pretty clearly the top team in the Big Ten right now. I think Oregon's right behind them. And I think Michigan and Penn State are kind of in the next tier after Ohio State and Oregon. So I do think this is a top 10 team. And in the 12-team playoff era now, your Penn State should be expecting to make the college football playoff next year.
They have a lot of key positions returning. Aside from key players, key positions. A lot of teams in the Big Ten are going to have a new starting quarterback. So you mentioned Ohio State, Oregon, and I know these are talented quarterbacks, but you're still having to transition to a new signal caller. Penn State doesn't have that issue, actually. Drew Allar is going to be going into his third season. This is where he truly turns the corner, and we'll dissect that a little more. But with Drew Allar, Nicholas Singleton, Kaytron Allen, I know the wide receivers weren't that great, but in addition to Julian Fleming, all of them are coming back. So Penn State's returning players, how much did that factor into where you weight them for going into next season?
It's huge, and we'll talk about Drew Allar in a second. But I love Drew Allar, and I honestly, I think he is wrongly being blamed for a lot of Penn State's offensive struggles last year. I think you can look at basically every other place in that offense. From the pass protection was not that great. I know they had Olufashanu, but other than that, it wasn't great. The receivers were not good at all. And then also the play calling was bad, which is why you saw Mike Yurcich get fired in November. So I think Drew Allar was a scapegoat for last year. And I mean, I have some numbers here that I put out my top 10 quarterbacks in the country list returning next year. I had Drew Allar number 8. And so many people were upset about that, saying, how the heck can you watch what he did last year and even have him close to it? And then I dove into the numbers, and there were some crazy numbers that he was basically hamstrung by his supporting cast last year. So I'm a big fan of Drew Allar. I still think with this new offense that I think will be suited to him a little bit better, he could turn into one of the top quarterbacks in college football and turn into one of the top quarterback prospects in next year's draft, honestly. So I'm a big believer in him. I do like Singleton and Allen, even though I came out with my top 10 running backs today. Neither of them made the cut. They were very close to it. And then, like I mentioned, the receiving core, Julian Fleming hasn't really done much in his career at Ohio State, but he was a former 5-star recruit. I'm excited to see what he can do. I am very optimistic about Penn State having a better offense than they did this past season.
What are your question marks, Max? Because you said that Penn State is a top 10 team, but they have certain questions to answer overall. I think going into and navigating the expanded Big Ten, I mean, just looking at it, I know that you can see, so you can read in between the lines and see like, okay, Penn State schematically and as a team, they need to address this. But when I'm looking big picture, expanded Big Ten, of course, you're going to be playing probably the toughest schedule in my memory. Maybe in the 90s and the 80s, things were different, but over the past 15, 20 years, I don't think Penn State's seen a regular season schedule like this. So now you're going to be playing a Washington team that, yeah, coaching changes, but will still be very good. They're going to have a veteran quarterback, right? And Jed Fish is leading that program. You don't play Oregon, but you got to travel to USC. And I know that UCLA just lost Chip Kelly and he's going to Ohio State. But this schedule, I think, is the most unforgiving. And then you go to, and then this gauntlet of Ohio State, UCLA, USC, Wisconsin, all in one time frame. And I know you get a bye week from coming back from Southern California, but then you go right back on the road to face the Wisconsin Badgers, who are probably going to be better under Luke Fickell now that he's starting to accumulate the players that fit better for his system, etc. So when you're looking at everything and how they match up, those are the things that I want to address. How do they navigate the Big Ten? But what are you seeing from teams, the team level and schematics that says like Penn State, if they want to do this to stay in the college football playoff, they absolutely need to address it?
I think it starts and ends with supporting Drew Allar more than they did last year. I think that was the biggest problem last year with Penn State, was that the receivers were bad. They were not getting open as much as they should be, and they were dropping. They had the 5th highest drop rate in the Power 5 last year. So they were not doing him any favors. The run game was almost non-existent because the offensive line just couldn't get any push. The offensive line also was getting Allar under pressure quickly. I mean, I think one of the other stats I found was he was under pressure within 2.5 seconds on about 21% of his dropbacks. And out of all the quarterbacks in my top 10 list that I put, the only one who had a higher percentage was Shedeur Sanders. And we all know how bad the Colorado offensive line was last year. Yeah. So and another thing too is that Allar, you look at him, you see the big time arm, you see the throws downfield that are beautiful. He had the lowest deep pass attempt rate in the Power 5, and actually in college football this past season, which is nuts considering, I know James Franklin attacked that reporter for saying, oh, just, throw it deep or whatever. And I understand, like, yeah, the question might not have been worded, but like there was a question there. Like there was like, hey, why are you not, targeting downfield? And I understand the receivers probably can get open downfield. The offensive line probably couldn't hold up for that long enough. But there was so much going wrong with that offense last year around Drew Allar. And I think it's wrongly being placed on his shoulders. I think he's a supremely talented quarterback. But, I think it starts and ends with you got to get better receivers. Julian Fleming has to be a better all the guys that are coming back have to be better. The running game has to be better as well with Allen and Singleton. I was a little bit disappointed by that this year. And the offensive line, after losing Olu Fashanu, I know they've recruited really well along the offensive line. They need to step up next year, too, and support him. And then, obviously, Andy Kotelnicki has got to be a better offensive coordinator than Mike Yurcich. He's got to be more creative and play to Allar's strengths more. Whereas it felt like a lot last year, it felt like the latter Christian Hackenberg years, where just like the offense was very clearly not suited to Christian Hackenberg. And that's what it felt like with Drew Allar at times in those big games last year. So they really got to support Drew Allar more. And if they do that, I do think they can, be one of the top teams in the country, honestly.
We've talked plenty about Drew Allar in the offense because that was the reason that Penn State was held back from being in the conversation around the college football playoff. Of course, they did face 2 college football playoff contenders, and they lost close games to those teams, matter of single digits. But the defense is what held it all together. The offense is what held them back. But there's still more to it. How can Andy Kotelnicki unlock Drew Allar's potential? I got some questions about Drew Allar himself because, like you said, I agree that he is a top-tier quarterback and has all the potential in the world. But there are definitely some things that he needs to correct. And we're going to discuss that in the upcoming segment here on Locked On Nittany Lions. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, the official sportsbook of Locked On. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. And right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 is a winner. That's $150 if your bet wins. Bet on all your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and so much more. You can combine all those bets together into a parlay for boosted odds and boosted winnings. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Shoot your shot. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. The Locked On Podcast Network is making history. Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and now it's also available on Amazon Fire TV in the free Fire TV Channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus the national shows covering each and every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now available on the free Fire TV Channels app as well as YouTube. Drew Allar, I mean, very, very impressive in his first season in terms of not turning the football over.
Yeah.
Showed the big playability and against weaker competition, right? West Virginia, we all thought the West Virginia game, a small sample size, it was only game one, but yes, the receivers were going to get open against West Virginia secondary. It was the smothering ones of Ohio State, Michigan, and frankly, some other competition. So yeah, that's nice that they looked good against West Virginia, Delaware, UMass, etc. But still, just down the stretch of the season, there was a dip in play calling. Andy Kotelnicki comes in. Andy Kotelnicki was essentially Penn State's top choice, and that's the difference in Penn State football 5 years ago as opposed to right now. Andy Kotelnicki was the #1 offensive coordinator on Penn State's big board for James Franklin, and they went and they got him, and they got him for the right price tag. So Kotelnicki, why Kotelnicki? What is it about Kotelnicki's system that's going to benefit Drew Allar? Because we saw him use more mobile types of quarterbacks. So this is not necessarily a question from me, but more of the Penn State fan base. Does Andy Kotelnicki fit Drew Allar more than he would Bo Pribula, actually? And Bo Pribula's been dominating winter workouts, and everybody, backup quarterback's most famous guy in town, right,
yeah,
Max?
Right.
Everybody likes the backup quarterback here. But how do you see Kotelnicki unlocking Drew Allar's potential?
I think I love Bo. I do. I think he reminds me a lot. I know he wears number 9, but it does like the kind of the Trace McSorley effect. You know, you kind of get that vibe from him. And maybe he would fit it. Again, it's just like you have this guy who I think if he doesn't make it work at Penn State, I think an NFL team will make it work with Drew Allar. So I'm not one of those people that thinks that Bo Pribula should even be in the discussion for the starting quarterback next year. I think it's clearly Drew Allar. What I like about Kotelnicki's offense, first of all, he plays to the strengths of the team, which is something that you need to do as an offense coordinator. I don't think Penn State did that really with Mike Yurcich too much. So he does that first. And the second of all, they actually, even though Jalen Daniels and Jason Bean have relatively strong arms, but not, that crazy, Kansas was third in the Power 5 in terms of average depth of target, in terms of how far the quarterback is throwing the ball downfield on an average at about 12.3 yards. So they were throwing the ball downfield. And like I just mentioned, Penn State was the lowest deep pass attempt rate in the country this past season. When you have a guy like Drew Allar who can sling it 70 yards downfield, and they were not throwing the ball downfield. They were acting as if I was their quarterback, and I can only throw like 25 yards downfield, honestly. Yeah. So I think, first of all, that is going to be great that they're actually going to throw the ball downfield more. And then also, you look at, we're talking about Penn State's receivers and how much they struggled. Kansas, in terms of receiving grade as a team, was tied for second in the country this past season, behind only Washington. And they were tied with Oregon. And you remember, Washington had Rome Odunze, Jalen McMillan, Jalen Polk. I mean, those are 3 NFL receivers right there. Oregon, Troy Franklin might be a first-round pick. Tez Johnson is one of the best returning receivers in college football. Can you name a single Kansas receiver right now? I mean, they had some solid players for them, but like it wasn't like they had a Troy Franklin or Rome Odunze or Jalen McMillan. Like it's not the same, but yet they had the second highest receiving grade in the country because I think a lot of it was they were schemed up really well. They were obviously catching the ball, which is something that Penn State's receivers struggled with. But I think that'll help too, in that the receivers should get a lot better under Andy Kotelnicki because he coached them up at a really high level. So, again, the fact that they're going to throw the ball downfield more, or they should, based off what he did last year at Kansas, and the fact that the receivers at Kansas were the second highest graded in the country, even though there wasn't like a true superstar in that receiver room, that makes me a lot more optimistic that, hey, this could get better and Drew should, be able to improve and finally show why I know you believe he's a top tier quarterback, and everyone else in the country is kind of doubting number 15 right now.
I think the biggest we see it. Drew Allar was an Elite 11 quarterback, and I know high school doesn't matter anymore, but top quarterback, depending on what ranking service you look at, but still very highly rated, almost a consent. I think a consensus 5-star. I think there were some sites that just had him as a really high-end 4-star as well. But at the end of the day, I mean, 24/7 had him as the number 1 quarterback in the class, and the talent is there. Okay, pocket presence. Sometimes his mechanics break down a little bit when he's under pressure, but what quarterback doesn't when there's a 250-pound defensive end chasing after him? I think he moves well for somebody his size. I'd say he's not a straight line speedster, but for somebody, that pocket mobility is really good. So it's not about the actual raw talent and what the potential is. He throws a pretty football, but sometimes I feel like Drew Allar, Max, plays too many mental gymnastics. Confidence is, I don't think he needs to be working with quarterback coaches as much as maybe, a confidence coach, a personal life coach, just because it seemed like when things got tough or post game, and that's your quarterback, that's your leader. He's gearing up to maybe be a captain this year. And you would like your quarterback, your third-year veteran in the program, to be a captain of the offense. But how does PFF gauge something like that? Because we all can see it, but there's not exactly a metric to say, okay, how do we rate confidence level? How does that affect performance? Do you even have question marks about Drew Allar's confidence going into a third season?
I think his confidence is okay. I understand what you're talking about, though, because I remember after the Ohio State game that I fortunately was able to attend. He was obviously, he kind of like broke down a little bit. It's like, man, that was on me.
It just felt like he was shaken up at times.
Yeah,
and honestly, throughout the season, Michigan as well, Rutgers even.
And I don't think he started like that. And again, brings me back to my point where it's just like, I'm sure the frustrations were just like, man, like it looked like he couldn't do anything out there. And that's why I understand some people, some of my relatives even, are like, man, it's crazy how high you think, like how good you think Drew Allar is. Like, I don't know what you're watching out there. It's like, it's just, you got to separate the player from what surrounds him, and what surrounded him was awful this past season, truly awful in terms of the play calling, in terms of like I said, the offensive line was not protecting as well as it was hyped up to be. I mean, Olu Fashanu was fantastic, don't get me wrong, but the other 4 were not really stepping up too well. And then the receivers were not getting open either. And then you have basically no run game because the offensive line was not getting the push that it needed to get. So Drew Allar, for all intents and purposes, was kind of on an island last year. And I can understand why your confidence would be shaken like that, because you kind of go out there thinking, man, I know I can do it, but I don't know if I could trust the other 10 guys on my team. And he'll never say that, obviously, because he's a terrific team player. He always will take the blame, even though it's rightly not on his shoulders. I mean, I don't think he should have been taking the blame last year, but he did do that, which I think shows the signs of a good leader and shows why he should be a team captain, and that he knows, hey, I'm the quarterback, even though I know deep down that it's really not my fault out there. I got to be better and elevate my supporting cast. So that's why I think the confidence was shaken a little bit, because I think he's just so frustrated knowing, hey, I have no chance every time I go out there, really at all, between the O-line and the receivers and even the coaching. So that's why I think you could have confidence questions. But I think in Kotelnicki's offense, if it works, and the receivers get better, the O-line gets better, that confidence will be built up again, because he'll know, like, hey, I know I can handle my end of the bargain. Now that I can trust my coaches, now that I can trust the other 10 guys I'm on the field with, that I think will build up his confidence more. But yeah, I understand what you're saying, because like last year, I mean, it really was. It felt like he was on an island last year, and I can understand why he would feel like, man, I can't do anything out there with what's surrounding me.
Before we move to the defense, the last final thought, just listening to you and saying, like, okay, the 4 offensive linemen weren't that great. And yeah, on this show, we talked about, like, hey, this offensive line was supposed to be the best in James Franklin's tenure. The Pro Football Focus analytics and the eye test do not back it up anymore, looking back through it. And Drew Allar, I think, did a lot to handle the pressure, but it was more so the fact, defenses could stack the box. They didn't have to play two high safety, so that didn't allow Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen really to move and navigate in between the tackles or even try to bounce it outside. And like you said, play calling. Mike Yurcich didn't scheme anything up. But this team is very identical offensively, other than the changes. And that's the thing. So the offensive line was not great last year, aside from Olu Fashanu, but you lose Olu Fashanu. You lose Caden Wallace, who I thought was a competent starter, and I thought he got much better towards the end of his Penn State career. You lose your two starting tackles on an offensive line that you're already critical of. You lose Hunter Norzad, who was a veteran, at least knew the game of football, maybe wasn't the best in terms of talent, but was an anchor as far as holding, the locker room together and everything, even though he transferred in. And then all the wide receivers are the same, except for a Julian Fleming that didn't really have much production at Ohio State. So what I'm getting from all of this, Max, is that Andy Kotelnicki is very, very, very important to this. And the only thing, and scheme is going to change everything in this case, because when I look at the offense, it's very similar in terms of what you bring back from a season ago. You hope that everyone takes a step forward, but it is truly down to what Andy Kotelnicki can do to make this offense that much better.
And that I think is the big question, is honestly the offensive line heading into next year, because Hunter Norzad was actually, he graded out at 75, which is solid. Pass protection, he wasn't great, but he was a pretty good run blocker. But yeah, you mentioned it. They lose so many starters. Now, I do like the addition of Nolan Rucci, the Wisconsin transfer at tackle. He was a former 5-star recruit. Now, he hasn't really done much in 3 years at Wisconsin, but former 5-star recruit like Julian Fleming. Hopefully, you're hoping that those two can come in and live up to the billing that they had coming out of high school. But other than that, yeah, man, I mean, I know Javen Williams, their guard, he was highly recruited coming out of high school. There's some other guys that were really highly rated coming out of high school. So you're kind of hoping that these young guys can develop and be the top recruits that they were coming out of high school. But yeah, the O-line is definitely going to be a major, I don't want to say concern, but I mean, if the fact that it was not great last year and you lose a ton of players from that offensive line,
the good ones anyway.
Yeah, the good ones even too. Yeah, it's going to be. It's a huge question mark. It's probably even a bigger question mark than receivers right now, honestly, is that can that offensive line hold up? And we mentioned it. I mean, we want Drew Allar to be able to throw the ball deep downfield because that's what he can do best. But will the offensive line give him enough time to find those guys deep downfield? Yeah. That I think is a huge question next year. And we'll see what Penn State does, honestly, to alleviate those concerns next year.
Manny Diaz leaves behind the defensive coordinator job to take the Duke head coaching job. And aside from some recruiting battles now that they have to deal with, they're able to get an ideal replacement, a former head coach, which James Franklin values immensely. And that's Tom Allen coming over from Indiana and taking the defensive coordinator job. But Manny Diaz, it's a large billing to live up to, big shoes to fill. As Manny Diaz at Penn State had a college football playoff type of defense, but Penn State could not make the CFP, even though the defense was #1 in the country in terms of a lot of overall stats, a lot of PFF metrics, I imagine. But now Penn State has to be constructed by Tom Allen, and we're going to discuss how he's going to do that in his first season in Happy Valley coming up next. Today's episode is also brought to you by Gametime. You got to download the Gametime app because buying tickets to your favorite events should not be stressful. Gametime is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all of the sports, music, comedy, and theater events near you. I've used the Gametime app. Some of the things that I like about the Gametime experience are the last-minute tickets, but you get flash deals, discounts on those last-minute tickets. It's easy to find and buy tickets for every kind of event in your area. You don't have to go searching around, wondering what's going on near you. It is all sorted for you by Gametime. And probably the best feature, image views of the seats. So you're not second guessing. You're not wondering, what is it going to look like from my seat? You have an accurate point of view ahead of time before you get to the venue or the event. Plus, lowest price guarantee and event cancellation protection included. So snag the tickets without the stress with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create that account, redeem code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. And remember, if you're not already, become an everydayer. Subscribe to Locked On Nittany Lions on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast for the latest analysis, conversations around your favorite Penn State sports. You can also keep up with what Max does over at Preferred Walk On. You can find that on YouTube. You can also follow him on X, formerly known as Twitter, for an analytical take on college football, but just discussions more so on the national level when it comes to our favorite sport here. And in this final segment, Penn State's defense is going to get a little bit of a makeover, kind of similar to the way that we looked at the offense, because they're going through similar types of changes. For better or for worse, Penn State's got to change a little bit schematically to try to keep the defense up to the top level. But also, they lost a lot of talent too. I mean, they're going to lose how many? There were so many NFL caliber players, NFL starters on that defense. Chop Robinson, Adisa Isaac, Curtis Jacobs, just to name a few. And then you have veterans that are going to be leaving as well. Keaton Ellison, even though in terms of production, he wasn't, up to the standard as those guys that I named immediately, but still a glue guy that is smart, knows how to, navigate everything. And that was a secondary and then Kalen King, Johnny Dixon, Daquan Hardy, all three of your starting cornerbacks in a and when they went 4-2-5 pretty frequently are gone now. You go to the transfer portal, you get two very capable guys. So we'll get to personnel in just a moment. But Tom Allen, do you expect him to, now that he's going from head coach and back to just focusing on football, what seems like a good thing for a lot of these coaches? Manny Diaz, right? Chip Kelly is going from a head coach to an offensive coordinator, and kind of just get back to what they do best and focus on one thing instead of all these other different things. So for Tom Allen, that's at least exciting from Penn State's point of view, is the fact that Tom Allen is a defensive mastermind, and then he can just focus on that side of the football.
Yeah, definitely. And I like the hire. I like Penn State kind of going after these reclamation projects at head coaches, coming in as defensive coordinator and trying to turn them into head coaches again, honestly. And great for Manny Diaz, honestly. He did an awesome job at Penn State the last couple of years. Fully deserved that head coach job at Duke. Honestly, he got the wrong end of the stick at Miami too. Like that was a tough place to win at that time. I think he kind of got a raw deal there. But Tom Allen, I mean, the 4-2-5 is kind of his staple. I don't know if we'll see as many stunts or blitzes or creeper packages like that kind of made the Manny Diaz defense so special in terms of how creative he was in terms of drawing up blitzes. But Tom Allen's defense, Indiana's defense did take a step back the last couple of years. They were one of the worst in the Big Ten, but before that, they were actually really good. So I'm excited to see what Tom Allen could do with Penn State's defense. Now, you mentioned it. They lose a lot of talent. They lose probably, I'm trying to think right now, 3 guys at least that'll be day 1 or day 2 picks in the NFL draft. They do bring back some talent, and I'm sure we'll get to those guys in just a second. But there are some question marks on this defense for sure, because we knew going in. I mean, we knew Chop, Kalen King, Olu Fashanu. Like, we knew that those 3 guys were all like superstar players, and we knew all 3 of them were going to be leaving, and now they are leaving. So, and Adisa Isaac really broke out in a big way. I believe actually PFF's lead draft analyst Trevor Sikkema, I believe, thinks that Adisa Isaac is a better prospect than Chop Robinson even is. Which I don't know if I agree with that, but he really likes Adisa Isaac. So. They got some really, really talented players leaving the program, but I am excited to see what some of these younger guys can do now in this new defense.
And like I said, they had to do a little bit of makeshift. AJ Harris comes in, a former top 50 prospect, and was down at Georgia, and Penn State's able to recruit him to transfer in. Then you get Jalen Kimber as well, and like you said, Tom Allen values the 4-2-5 defense, and I think with UCLA, USC, Oregon, Washington, those schools coming in, you almost have to have. And Manny Diaz, I don't want to say, and you know better than I would here, but Manny Diaz had the 4-3 attacking style defense. I feel like Tom Allen is going to have this hybrid defense where the 4-3 is going to work against certain opponents and the 4-2-5. And I'm not saying that Manny Diaz couldn't adjust, but Tom Allen already kind of naturally comes in with a hybrid defense that benefits linebackers. Abdul Carter still has a lot more potential to be tapped into. But I think the biggest question mark that I want to look at is the secondary. Yeah. We don't know what AJ Harris can do. Jalen, we know the potential, but we don't know what he can actually do since he's only had 1 year of college football and didn't play as much. We know what Jalen Kimber can do to an extent, but I don't really like that film from a season ago because Florida's secondary was one of the worst in college football. I think bottom 5, bottom 10 in the analytic, and that was statistically. Yeah. The PFF's analytics probably have them graded a lot worse or in that same ballpark there. So those two guys come in, they're going to compete for a starting spot, and then against Ole Miss, right? This is a future look at what Penn State's going to have. This is the look ahead. I don't look at the bowl games as a cap to the 2023 or the previous season. It's a future look. It's a preseason game for the upcoming one. And Cam Miller, Zion Tracy got tested, and they failed more often than not against a good, and that was an Ole Miss offense that was very capable, very potent with a returning quarterback and a lot of returning wide receivers. And of course, well, Quinshon Judkins, but he transfers, right? But not the point here. So the secondary, a lot of good safeties, but boundary corners and slot corners as well, they are going to have to live up to some lofty expectations here. Yeah,
definitely. I think the secondary is a big concern, or big question mark. And I think, AJ Harris, I'm extremely excited about. I think he's a guy that, coming out of high school, like you said, he's a top, I think, 40 recruit, top 50 recruit, going to Georgia, played a little bit as a freshman, not really too much to glean off of. So really what you're going off of is just what he was recruited out of high school. And he was rated really highly coming out of high school. So that's a big time get for Penn State. Hopefully he can live up to that hype. And I think he will need to immediately as a sophomore. The other one I want to point out that I think might be one of the most underrated players in college football. And like I said, I'm putting out my top 10 players at every position list. This guy will be at least in the top 5. I think I have him right now at number 3 at his position, is Kevin Winston Jr., the safety. Yeah. This guy is an absolute freaking superstar. I was watching his tape the last couple of weeks. I couldn't believe how nobody was talking about this guy this past year. He is such an all-around stud. It reminds me a lot of like Jaquan Brisker, where it's just like, dude, everyone in State College knew how good number 9 was for Penn State. Kind of no one else kind of figured that out until the NFL draft came around. People started to watch Brisker's tape and were like, oh my God, like where did this guy come from? And all of a sudden now he's playing for the Bears and doing a great job for the Bears. Winston kind of reminds me of that, whereas like I kept seeing his name pop up in our grading system, grading out really highly. And I was like, oh, let me check this guy out. I can't believe how, the safety position in college football is rich next year. Honestly, he's probably the most loaded position on defense in the in the nation. And I think Kevin Winston Jr. is up there with the best of them, man, with Caleb Downs, with Malachi Starks. I believe these are the only 2 safeties I have ranked above him on my list right now. So I think he is a guy that will be the star of Penn State's defense next year, along with a couple linebackers I really like as well. And Denai Dennis Sutton, I'm really excited to see what he can do as a full-time starter. But, I think Kevin Winston Jr., that's the one thing holding me from really being concerned about the secondary is that I think they have an absolute superstar at safety in Kevin Winston Jr.
Does Penn State have enough star power in general? And I think the safety, they might run 3 safeties because Jalen Reed, I think, is very underrated. Zachy Wheatley is almost forgotten about as well. So the secondary might benefit from using safeties, and they're not just zone guys. They can do man-to-man coverage as well. But overall in the defense, this is the final thought that we'll finish with here, Max. Abdul Carter, Denai Dennis Sutton, KJ Winston kind of take over as that trio that Penn State had from last season of not Adisa Isaac played up to it, but in the beginning was not considered that player. It was Chop Robinson, Curtis Jacobs / Abdul Carter, and then Kalen King. So now that changes to Winston, Abdul Carter fully taking over, and Denai Dennis Sutton. Does Penn State have enough star power to remain around? Because they're not going to be number 1. It's so hard to duplicate that kind of production from a season ago, being the number 1 defense in so many categories. But can Penn State remain around the top 10, ideally top 15, even with what they have coming back?
I think they can. I think they have the star power. I do. I think corner is a big question, and I think it's going to be huge. Whether or not AJ Harris is as good as advertised, I think it's going to be huge as to how good Penn State's defense is next year. Because like you mentioned, there are going to be, which I think is important for Tom Allen, to be multiple in his looks, and that you're going to face teams like Ohio State and Michigan that are going to run the piss out of the football next year. Like they're going to want to run the football on every single play. Ohio State, especially with what they have returning in terms of run game, and then Michigan, we all know about Michigan. And I don't even know if they have a quarterback who they can trust to throw the ball next year. So Donovan Edwards is going to be relied on heavily. Those teams are going to want to have heavy boxes, go attack them. then you play teams like Oregon. I know they're not playing Oregon, but like Oregon, USC, all these new Washington coming in. You're going to need to, put the guys in the back end. So the Big Ten is very unique in that they have so many offensive schemes that you're going to have to go against. Where like sometimes you're going to have to put 9 guys in the box and just attack the run. Sometimes you're going to have to put 6 guys in the back end and defend the pass that way. So they're going to need to do that. And I think the secondary is a big question with that. But yeah, to answer your question, I do think Kevin Winston Jr., like I mentioned, is a top 3 to 5 safety in college football. Abdul Carter, I think, is a top 5 linebacker in college football. And I honestly, I want to shout out, I know Kalen didn't have a great year, but I think his twin brother did. I think Kobe was very good last year for Penn State's linebacking core. And I think between him and Abdul Carter, they might have the best linebacker unit in college football. It's going to be close. Iowa has a really good one too, but Penn State's going to be up there as one of the best linebacker units between him and Kobe King. I'm a big fan of Kobe King. I think he had a great year last year. And then you mentioned Dennis Sutton has always flashed whenever he was on the field. Never really was a full-time starter, though, with Chop and Adisa Isaac kind of taking over. But, yeah, whenever Dennis Sutton was on the field, he looked really good. He's a former 5-star. I'm really excited to see what he can do. And I think he could be a breakout star for Penn State next year.
Max Chadwick of Pro Football Focus, college football analyst for PFF, and also you can find him over at his show, Preferred Walk On. Max, I enjoy these conversations a ton because we get a finite view under the microscope looking at what Penn State football can do, and I appreciate you helping me do early season preview for what the Nittany Lions have coming back going into 2024. Thanks so much for the time.
Of course, Zach. Thanks for having me on.